I spent 30 years of my life believing I was the apex predator of the Oregon mountains, a hunter who never missed. But on a cold October morning in 1974, I took a shot that destroyed the man I used to be. I thought I was aiming at a record-breaking bear until I walked up to the blood trail and saw hands, human-like hands, clutching the wound. What happened in that canyon wasn't a trophy kill. It was a penance that forced me to live side by side with a creature that science says doesn't exist. If you want to hear more true stories about the secrets hiding in the deep woods, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next video. Here is my confession. I was 52 years old in the autumn of 1974, a man carved out of the rough timber and basalt of the Oregon high country. I had built my entire existence around the barrel of a rifle, measuring my worth in tag fills and freezer meat. I wasn't a sportsman in the modern sense. I didn't hunt for the thrill or the trophy on the wall, though I had plenty of both. I hunted because I believed I was the apex predator of those mountains, a master of the landscape who had earned the right to take life. I moved through the woods with an arrogance that only 30 years of successful kills can grant you, believing I understood the hierarchy of the forest better than the animals themselves. I considered myself a serious hunter, a professional in a world of weekend amateurs who smelled like soap and missed easy shots. I knew the migration routes of the elk before they did, and I could spot a buck in deep cover just by the flicker of an ear. I had taken more life than I cared to count: deer, elk, bear, cougar, and I had done it without a flicker of remorse or ethical conflict. To me, the forest was a grocery store and a playground, and the animals were simply resources waiting to be harvested by the man with a steady hand. I walked with a heavy tread, confident that nothing in the woods could challenge me or surprise me. That October morning was crisp, the air tasting of frost and pine resin, the kind of day that makes your blood run hot and your senses sharp. I was hunting alone in a remote canyon deep in the Cascade Range, a place where the map lines get fuzzy and the trails disappear. I was moving silently through a stand of thick timber, cradling my .30-06 like it was an extension of my own arm. I was tracking a bull elk I had spotted days earlier, focused entirely on the sign on the ground. My world narrowed down to the pursuit. I felt invincible, wrapped in the camouflage of my experience, the king of the quiet canyon. Then I saw the movement, a flash of dark color about 200 yards downslope in a break in the trees. It was massive, far larger than the elk I was tracking, and my brain immediately shifted gears to bear. It was moving through the shadows with a strange, heavy fluidity, upright enough that I assumed it was a grizzly scenting the wind. I didn't pause to use my binoculars. I didn't pause to check the wind or verify the target. I saw mass, I saw fur, and I saw a target that would be the crown jewel of my career. The predator instinct took over instantly, bypassing logic and caution. I dropped to one knee, bringing the rifle stock to my shoulder in a motion so practiced it was muscle memory. The crosshairs found the center of the dark mass, hovering over the chest area where the vitals would be. I didn't look at the gait, which was too smooth for a bear, or the width of the shoulders, which were too broad for an elk. I saw only the kill zone. I controlled my breathing, letting out half a breath to steady the reticle, my heart rate slowing down into the icy rhythm of the shooter. I was a machine of destruction, calibrated perfectly for this exact moment. The creature stepped into a patch of sunlight, but even then, my arrogance blinded me to what I was seeing. I interpreted the upright posture as a bear standing to look around, a momentary pause that sealed its fate. I didn't wait for a better angle. I trusted my bullet to do the work through the brush and the bone. I squeezed the trigger, the recoil slamming into my shoulder like a familiar friend, the crack of the rifle shattering the morning silence. It was a perfect shot, executed with the cold precision of a man who never missed. The impact was audible, a wet thwack of lead hitting flesh that echoed up the canyon walls. But the reaction wasn't what I expected. A bear would have roared or dropped instantly, an elk would have buckled. This creature spun around, clutching its chest with a hand, a distinctly human-like hand, and let out a sound that wasn't a roar. It was a high-pitched, shocked gasp, followed by a grunt of confusion and pain. It stumbled backward, crashing through a rhododendron bush, and then fell heavily to the forest floor. I stood up, cycling the bolt to chamber another round, fueled by the adrenaline of the hit. I waited for the thrashing, for the death throes of a large animal, but the woods went eerily silent. There was no growling, no snapping of jaws, just a low whimpering sound drifting up the slope. It sounded terrifyingly like a man who had been sucker punched, a sound of vulnerability that pricked a tiny hole in my confidence. I started down the slope, moving fast, eager to claim my prize and see exactly how big this bear really was. As I got closer, the smell hit me, not the rotten meat stink of a bear, but a heavy, musky odor of wet dog and human sweat. I pushed through the last of the brush, my rifle ready, and saw the body lying in the ferns. It was curled on its side, one massive arm draped over its chest, blood dark and bright pooling on the leaves. But the shape was wrong. The legs were too long, the feet were bare and massive, and the head wasn't an animal. It had a face. A flat, leathery face with a heavy brow and a nose that looked like mine, only broader. I stopped dead, the rifle slipping in my sweaty hands, my breath catching in a throat that had suddenly gone dry as dust. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a monster. It was a Sasquatch. I had shot a Bigfoot. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, shattering the hunter's pride that had defined me for 50 years. I stood there, a killer in the quiet woods, looking down at a legend that was bleeding out because of my ego. And then the creature opened its eyes, amber, intelligent, and filled with pain, and looked right at me. I stood there in the ravine, my boots sinking into the soft mulch, staring at the creature that was bleeding because of my reflexive, thoughtless action. The rifle, which had always felt like a scepter of power in my hands, suddenly felt like a heavy, cold bar of lead that I wanted to drop. The silence of the woods wasn't the triumphant quiet of a successful hunt anymore. It was an accusing silence, a vacuum that sucked the air out of my lungs. I looked at the blood spreading across the creature's chest, dark, thick, and far too much of it, and felt a nausea that had nothing to do with the sight of gore. It was the sickness of realization, the gut punch of knowing that I hadn't shot a beast. I had shot something that had a soul. The creature made a sound then. Not a growl, not a roar, but a sound that will echo in my nightmares until the day I die. It was a low, vibrating groan that rose into a sharp, questioning cry, a sound of pure confusion and betrayal. It sounded terrifyingly like a human asking why, in a language I didn't speak but understood perfectly. It wasn't the sound of an animal reacting to stimulus. It was the sound of a conscious being reacting to injustice. It clutched the wound with both hands, its fingers slick with red, rocking back and forth in a motion that was so universally human, it made my knees weak. I looked at its face, really looked at it, stripped of the adrenaline and the hunter's filter. The features were heavy and rugged, covered in fine hair, but the structure underneath was undeniable. It had a forehead that wrinkled in pain, lips that pulled back to reveal gritted teeth, and eyes that were filled with tears. Yes, tears. I watched a single, clear drop roll down that leathery cheek, cutting a track through the dust and grime. Animals feel pain, I knew that, but animals don't cry from the emotional shock of being hurt. That single tear washed away 50 years of my justification for hunting. I felt something crack open inside of me, a hard shell of pride and identity that had been sealed since I was a young man. I had spent my life telling myself that I was part of the natural order, a predator keeping the balance. But standing over this broken giant, I realized I was just a vandal, a man with a machine who had destroyed something he couldn't comprehend. The shame was hot and suffocating, rising up my neck and burning my face. I wasn't the master of the woods. I was an intruder who had brought death into a sanctuary. The creature tried to move away from me, pushing itself backward with its heels, its legs thrashing weakly in the ferns. It was terrified. Its eyes locked on me with a horror that mirrored my own. Every time it moved, fresh blood pumped from the wound, painting the green leaves in a macabre spray. It gasped, a wet, bubbling sound that indicated I might have nicked a lung, and the panic in its eyes spiked. It thought I was coming to finish it off, to put a second round in its head like I would a wounded deer. I looked at its hands again. Hands that were grasping at the rhododendron roots, trying to pull its heavy body to safety. They had fingernails, dirty and cracked, but clearly nails, not claws. They had thumbs that opposed the fingers, gripping with dexterity. I looked at my own hands, still white-knuckling the rifle stock, and saw the terrifying similarity. I had shot a cousin, distant, wild and strange, but a cousin nonetheless. The biological reality of it crashed down on me, turning the hunt into a crime scene. The rifle slipped from my fingers, hitting the forest floor with a dull thud that sounded like a gavel. I didn't care if the scope lost its zero. I didn't care if the mud fouled the action. I couldn't hold the weapon anymore. It felt radioactive, contaminated by the mistake I had made. I held my hands up, palms open, trying to project a harmlessness that was a lie. I had already done the harm. I was the source of the pain, the architect of this disaster, and showing my empty hands felt like a pathetic, empty gesture. I took a step forward, my movements slow and exaggerated, trying to telegraph that I wasn't going to attack again. The creature flinched, letting out a sharp hiss of air, and tried to curl into a ball to protect its vitals. It was expecting the coup de grace, the final violence. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking so bad it was barely audible. I didn't know. I was apologizing to a Bigfoot in the middle of nowhere, pleading my case to a judge that was bleeding out on the ground. I moved closer, fighting the primal urge to run away and pretend this never happened. It would have been so easy to leave, to let nature take its course and let the forest swallow the evidence of my sin. But I couldn't. I was tethered to this spot by the gravity of my guilt. I had to see the damage. I had to know if I had killed it. I approached the creature slowly, stepping over the rifle I had dropped, crossing a line from hunter to something else entirely. The creature watched me come, its breathing hitching, its amber eyes tracking every micro-movement of my body. It was wary, tense as a coiled spring, but as I got closer, it didn't strike out. It seemed to sense the shift in my energy, the collapse of my aggression. It looked at my empty hands, then at my face, searching for the malice that had pulled the trigger. It didn't find it. What it found was a terrified old man with tears in his eyes, stepping into the blood-soaked circle to see if he could fix what he had broken. I knew with a cold, sinking certainty that I had to stop the bleeding, or this creature would be dead within the hour. The bullet had done exactly what I designed it to do. It had created a catastrophic wound channel intended to drop a 1,000-pound animal in its tracks. I looked at the bright arterial spray on the ferns and realized that walking away wasn't just cowardice, it was murder. I had to get close enough to apply pressure to a wound on a creature that was powerful enough to tear my arms off, a creature that currently viewed me as the architect of its pain. It was the most dangerous decision of my life, eclipsing any cliff I'd climbed or river I'd crossed. But the alternative was watching the light go out in those amber eyes. I took a step closer, my hands raised high, telegraphing my intent with every muscle in my body. "I'm going to help you," I said, my voice sounding rough and foreign in the silence of the canyon. "I'm sorry, I'm going to stop the blood." The words were meaningless to it, just sounds in the air, but the tone was universal. A low, soothing cadence devoid of aggression. The creature watched me, its chest heaving, its teeth gritted in a grimace that was terrifyingly familiar. It tensed as I invaded its personal space, a low growl building in its throat that vibrated the ground under my boots, warning me that I was entering the kill zone. I knelt down in the bloody mud, inches from its massive legs, the smell of musk and copper filling my nose and making my head swim. I was close enough now to see the individual pores on its skin, the gray flecks in its iris, the sheer density of the muscle under the fur. It could reach out and crush my skull before I could blink, and for a second, I thought it might. Its hand twitched, fingers curling into a fist, but then it looked at my empty hands and paused. It was making a calculation, weighing the certainty of bleeding to death against the risk of trusting the enemy. It let out a sharp hiss of air and slumped back, allowing me to touch it. I pulled the large hunting knife from my belt, and the creature's eyes widened, its body going rigid with panic. "No, no," I whispered, tossing the knife far away into the brush to show I wasn't finishing the job. I unbuttoned my heavy flannel shirt, stripping it off to use as a bandage, shivering as the cold mountain air hit my skin. I folded the thick wool into a pad, moving slowly, letting it see exactly what I was doing. I reached out toward the wound on its chest and it flinched, a massive shudder of pain and fear, but it didn't strike my hand away. It was letting me work. I pressed the wool pad against the gaping hole in its chest, leaning my weight into it to stem the flow. The creature let out a roar that was deafening at this range, a sound of pure agony that echoed off the canyon walls and sent birds scattering from the trees. Its other hand shot out, grabbing my forearm with a grip that felt like a steel vise, bruising the bone instantly. I froze, gritting my teeth, waiting for it to snap my arm, but it didn't. It was just holding on, grounding itself against the pain, using me as an anchor while it rode out the wave of suffering I had caused. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, locked in a tableau of violence and healing. My hands were slick with its blood, pressing down on the ruin of its flesh, while its hand crushed my arm. I looked into its face, inches from mine, and saw the pupils dilate and contract, saw the sweat beading on its leathery brow. It was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, fighting to stay conscious. I talked to it the whole time, a stream of apologies and reassurances, telling it to hold on, to stay with me. I wasn't a hunter anymore. I was a field medic trying to save a patient I had assaulted. Eventually the bleeding slowed, the pressure doing its work, and the creature's grip on my arm loosened slightly. It looked down at the bloody shirt pressed to its chest, then up at me, its expression shifting from terror to a bewildered confusion. It couldn't understand why the man who brought the thunder and the pain was now trying to keep the life inside. It was a paradox that seemed to short-circuit its defensive instincts. It let out a long, shuddering sigh, its head lolling back against the moss, exhausted by the trauma. It was still alive, but it was weak, far too weak to stand or defend itself. I realized then that applying a bandage wasn't going to be enough. The sun was starting to dip below the ridge line, casting long, cold shadows across the canyon floor. If I left now to get help, though who would I tell? The cold would set in, and shock would kill it before morning. The wound needed to be cleaned, the creature needed water, and it needed warmth. I looked at the massive, helpless form lying in the ferns and knew I wasn't going home tonight. I wasn't going home for a long time. I was tethered to this spot by a cord of guilt that was stronger than steel. I stood up slowly, my knees cracking, and backed away to gather wood for a fire. The creature watched me go, a flicker of panic in its eyes, thinking I was abandoning it. "I'm staying," I said, pointing to the ground. "I'm staying right here." I gathered deadfall and dry branches, building a fire ring not far from where it lay, close enough to share the warmth but far enough to give it space. As the first flames crackled to life, illuminating the darkening woods, the creature watched the fire with a mix of fascination and fear. It had probably seen campfires from a distance its whole life, but it had never been invited to sit by one. I set up a primitive camp, moving with the efficiency of a man who has spent his life outdoors, but with a new, heavy burden on my soul. I boiled water in my canteen cup to clean the wound. I fashioned a windbreak from pine boughs, and I settled in for the long vigil. The creature drifted in and out of consciousness, its massive chest rising and falling in the firelight. I sat there, with my back against a tree, watching over the thing I had tried to kill, listening to the forest settle into night. The line between man and beast had been blurred by blood, and as the stars came out, I wondered if I would survive the penance I had just begun. I made the decision that night, staring into the embers of the fire while the creature slept fitfully beside me. I wasn't going back to town, and I wasn't going to leave him to the coyotes or the infection. I had broken him, and by God, I was going to fix him or die trying. The next morning, I set about turning our temporary bivouac into a survival camp capable of sustaining 2 large mammals for the long haul. I used my hatchet to cut saplings and strip bark, fashioning a sturdy lean-to structure against a rock overhang that would keep the rain off his massive frame. I worked with a manic energy, driven by the need to be useful, to offer something other than violence to the equation. The creature watched me work through half-closed eyes, his breathing still shallow but steady. He seemed baffled by the construction, tracking the way I wove the pine boughs to create a waterproof roof. Occasionally, he would let out a low grunt when I struggled with a heavy log, a sound that felt like encouragement, or perhaps just an acknowledgement of my effort. When I finished, I carpeted the floor with deep moss and dried ferns, creating a soft bed to keep him off the cold ground. I helped him move inside, supporting his weight as he hobbled, and felt a strange swell of pride when he settled into the shelter with a sigh of relief. My role shifted from builder to provider, and for the first time in 30 years, I used my hunting skills not to take trophies, but to sustain life. I fashioned a fish trap from willow branches and placed it in the creek, catching trout that were sluggish in the cold water. I scoured the hillsides for late-season berries and dug for edible roots, things I hadn't bothered with since I was a Boy Scout. Every time I pulled a fish from the water, I didn't feel the usual thrill of the catch. I felt the heavy responsibility of feeding a mouth that was much larger than mine. I was a servant to the appetite of a giant, a role reversal that stripped away the last of my ego. Feeding him was an intimate, terrifying ritual that required a level of trust I hadn't earned. I would roast the fish on a flat stone by the fire, picking out the bones with my knife, and offer the meat to him on a piece of bark. At first, he was hesitant, sniffing the food for poison, his eyes locked on mine. But hunger won out, and he would take the food with fingers that were surprisingly gentle. Watching a creature that could snap a tree in half delicately eat a trout fillet was a surreal lesson in contrast. He ate with dignity, never snatching, always waiting for me to offer the next piece. Keeping the wound clean was the hardest part, a daily battle against infection that required me to touch the damage I had inflicted. I boiled water in my canteen cup and used strips of my undershirt as compresses, scrubbing the edges of the bullet hole while he gritted his teeth. He never struck me, even when the pain must have been blinding. He would grip a tree root or the earth itself, channeling his agony into the ground rather than at me. He understood that the burning sensation of the hot water was the price of healing, a necessary evil that I was inflicting to save him. I fetched water constantly, acting as a bucket brigade of one, ensuring he stayed hydrated to replace the blood he had lost. I would hold the canteen to his lips, tilting it carefully so he wouldn't choke, wiping the spillover from his chin with my sleeve. In those moments, staring at the gray stubble on his chin and the deep lines around his eyes, the monster vanished completely. I saw an old man, a patriarch who was tired and hurt, dependent on the mercy of a stranger. It humbled me in a way that church never had, forcing me to confront the fragility of the life I had treated so casually. As the weeks dragged on, the silence between us began to feel less like a wall and more like a bridge. He spent his waking hours watching me, his amber eyes following my movements around the camp with a deep, contemplative intelligence. He wasn't just observing a human, he was studying me, this specific man who had shot him and was now nursing him. I wondered what he saw. Did he see the killer, or did he see the penitent? There was no hatred in his gaze, no malice, just a profound curiosity about why I had stayed. I began to talk to him, filling the empty air with the sound of my voice just to keep the madness of isolation at bay. I told him about my life, about the hunts, about the mistakes I had made with my family back in town. I confessed my sins to a confessor who couldn't speak English but seemed to understand the tone of regret better than any priest. He would listen, tilting his head, sometimes making a low, rumbling sound in his chest that vibrated against the shelter wall. It felt like absolution, a quiet forgiveness granted by the only judge that mattered in that canyon. The weather turned colder, the frost settling deeper into the valley, but the fire kept us alive. We fell into a rhythm of survival: wake, eat, clean the wound, gather wood, sleep. The outside world faded away, the politics and the news and the job I had left behind becoming abstract concepts. The only reality was the pulse in his neck and the heat of the fire. I realized I didn't want to leave. I had found a purpose here in the penance, a clarity that I had been searching for down the barrel of a gun my whole life. Then, one morning in late November, the dynamic shifted. I woke up to find the shelter empty, the moss bed impressed with his weight but cold. Panic surged through me. Had he left? Had he died in the night? I scrambled out of the lean-to and saw him standing by the creek, leaning heavily on a staff he had broken from a deadfall. He was upright, shaky, but standing on his own 2 feet for the first time in weeks. He looked at me and nodded, a gesture of triumph. The patient was recovering, and as I walked toward him, I saw a new light in his eyes. He wasn't just healing. He was preparing to show me something. As his strength returned, the dynamic of our days shifted from recovery to instruction. He no longer spent his time sitting by the fire. He began to move through the canyon with a renewed purpose, often signaling for me to follow him. He moved slower than before, favoring the healed leg, but his silence in the brush was still absolute. I followed him like a clumsy apprentice, my boots loud on the gravel, realizing that I was being taken to school. He wasn't leading me to food or water, he was leading me to scenarios, setting up classrooms in the wild to teach a curriculum I hadn't known existed. The first lesson happened near a game trail where I had set snares in my youth. He stopped suddenly, freezing in mid-step, and pointed a massive finger at a patch of brambles ahead. A rabbit was caught there, not in a snare, but tangled naturally in the thorns, thrashing in a panic that would eventually attract a coyote. My instinct, the hunter's instinct, was to see it as an easy meal, a problem solved by a quick twist of the neck. I reached for my knife, stepping forward to claim the calories, but he blocked my path with his arm. He shook his head, a slow, solemn movement, and made a low, chiding sound. He approached the rabbit himself, moving with such profound stillness that the animal stopped struggling before he even touched it. He didn't grab it roughly. He scooped it up, thorns and all, cradling it against his massive chest, until its heart rate slowed. Then, with a motion so fast it blurred, he ended its life. There was no fear, no prolonged suffering, just a sudden switch from being to non-being. It was a mercy kill, executed with a surgical precision that prioritized the animal's peace over the predator's hunger. He looked at me then, his amber eyes intense, communicating a standard of conduct. If you must take, you take quickly. You do not allow fear. He placed the rabbit on a flat stone, arranging its limbs with a strange, ritualistic care, smoothing the fur down. He didn't toss it into a pile or hang it by its feet. He treated the carcass with dignity. He gestured to the body, then to his own chest where the bullet scar was healing, and then to me. The connection was like a lightning bolt. He was showing me that pain is universal, that the panic I had inflicted on him was the same panic the rabbit felt. He was teaching me empathy for the prey, a concept that had never entered my mind when I was looking through a scope. The lessons escalated in complexity. A few days later, we tracked a deer that had been wounded by a cougar but escaped, limping badly and trailing blood. We found it bedded down in a thicket, suffering, its eyes wide with the terror of being hunted. I raised my rifle. I had started carrying it again for defense, though I never loaded it, instinctively sighting in on the animal. The creature reached out and gently pushed the barrel down. He didn't want the noise. He didn't want the violence of the explosion. He wanted the intimacy of the responsibility. He moved into the thicket, making a low humming sound that seemed to act as a sedative on the deer. It didn't try to run. It watched him come, mesmerized or perhaps accepting of the end. He placed one hand over its eyes, blinding it to the world, and the other on its neck. In one fluid motion, he ended its suffering. It was brutal in its efficiency but tender in its execution. He looked back at me, his hands on the still animal, challenging me to understand the difference between killing from a distance and killing up close. He was showing me that you must own the death you create. He began to critique my past methods through pantomime, a silent theater of ethics performed in the snow. He would pick up a stick, hold it like a rifle, and mimic my posture, hunched, tense, eager. Then he would make a face of disgust and throw the stick away. He would point to his eyes, then to the woods, shaking his head. He was telling me that the gun made me blind, that the distance made me cruel. The weapon disconnected the shooter from the reality of the life they were taking, turning a living being into a target. He wanted me to feel the weight of the life, not just the recoil of the stock. One afternoon, he demonstrated the concept of choice, the hardest lesson for a hunter who measured success by tags filled. We were watching a herd of elk moving through the valley below, heavy with winter coats. A young buck lagged behind, a perfect target for any sportsman. The creature pointed to it, then looked at me, waiting. When I didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon, he nodded. Then he pointed to a pregnant doe and shook his head violently. He traced the shape of a belly in the air. He was teaching me about the future, about the stewardship of the herd. You don't take the mothers, you don't take the future. He showed me that he could kill anything he wanted at any time. I watched him stalk a grouse, getting within inches of it, only to let it fly away. He looked at me and tapped his chest, then opened his hand, the sign for release. He was showing me that power isn't demonstrated by what you kill, but by what you spare. Mercy was a choice that only the strong could make. The realization hit me hard. I had spent my life killing to prove I was strong, but I had actually been weak. True strength was having the power of life and death and choosing life. The most profound moment came when he led me to a carcass of a deer that had died of natural causes, frozen in the snow. He didn't touch it. He walked around it, giving it a wide berth, and signaled for me to do the same. He made a gesture of covering his face, a sign of respect for the dead. He was showing me that not everything in the woods is a resource. Some things belong to the earth, to the scavengers, to the cycle. My arrogance had told me the forest was a supermarket. He was teaching me it was a temple. These lessons chipped away at the man I had been, dismantling the ego that had pulled the trigger in October. I looked at my hands, calloused and stained with soot, and wondered how much blood I had spilled without a second thought. I had been a butcher, not a hunter. The creature, the monster, possessed a code of ethics more rigid and noble than any law I had followed. He had forgiven me for shooting him, and now he was trying to ensure I never made that mistake again. As November faded into December, the creature's mobility returned fully, and I sensed that our time in the classroom of the canyon was drawing to a close. He became more insistent, more urgent in his teachings, as if he had a final exam prepared for me. One morning, he didn't lead me to a game trail or a carcass. He led me deeper into the wilderness than we had ever gone, moving with a grim determination. He wasn't looking for food. He was looking for a specific location. He was taking me to see the reason he had been in the valley that day, the secret he had almost died protecting. One morning in late autumn, when the frost was thick enough to crunch like glass under our feet, the creature woke me before dawn. He didn't nudge me or make a sound. He simply stood over my sleeping bag, blocking out the stars, until his presence pulled me from my dreams. He waited for me to lace my boots and grab my coat, his posture rigid with a new kind of intensity. He didn't head for the creek or the game trails we usually frequented. He turned toward the steepest, darkest part of the canyon wall, a route that looked impassable. He looked back at me once, a sharp, commanding glance that said, "Keep up. This matters." We hiked for hours, climbing out of the valley floor and into a landscape of jagged basalt and twisted scrub oak that no human had touched in a century. My lungs burned in the thin, cold air, and my legs screamed with the effort of matching his stride, but he never slowed down. He moved with a singular focus, ignoring the deer we spooked and the easy water sources we passed. He wasn't foraging, he was commuting. We were traveling to a specific destination, a point on the map that he held in his mind with absolute clarity. I realized with a growing sense of dread that we were approaching the heart of his territory, the sanctuary he had been trying to get back to when I shot him. By midday, we reached a hidden bold depression high in the mountains, protected on three sides by sheer cliffs and screened by a dense thicket of ancient hemlocks. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, signaling for me to stay back and stay low. The change in his demeanor was instant. The confident teacher vanished, replaced by a gentle, solicitous protector. He let out a soft, chirping whistle, a sound so bird-like and delicate that it seemed impossible coming from a chest that size. He waited, his head cocked, listening to the silence of the hollow with an intensity that made me hold my breath. A moment later, a responding whistle drifted from the shadows of the hemlocks, hesitant and quiet. Movement flickered in the deep shade, and a second figure stepped cautiously into the light. It was smaller, much smaller, perhaps 5 feet tall, with lighter fur that looked soft and downy. It moved with the skittish, jerky motions of a young animal that has spent too much time alone and afraid. It wasn't a mate, it was a juvenile, a child left waiting in the safe zone while the parent went out to secure the perimeter, a parent who hadn't come back for weeks. The reunion was a punch to the gut that knocked the wind out of me. The large male, my patient, my teacher, stepped forward and knelt on one knee, bringing himself down to the younger one's level. The juvenile rushed him, burying its face in his massive chest, making high-pitched mewling sounds of relief and distress. He wrapped his arms around the smaller creature, rocking it back and forth, stroking its head with those massive, scarred hands. It was a scene of such raw, unfiltered love that I felt like an intruder, a voyeur witnessing a private moment of salvation. Then the reality of what I was seeing crashed down on me, turning my blood to ice. I looked at the juvenile, thin and anxious, and realized it had likely been starving while I nursed the male back to health. But worse, I realized what almost happened. If my aim had been true that day in October, if the bullet had struck 3 inches to the left and shattered his heart, this child would be dead. It would have waited here in the cold, whistling for a father who was never coming, until the snow or the cougars claimed it. I hadn't just shot a monster or a trophy. I had shot a father. I had almost orphaned a dependent being that had the emotional capacity to grieve and the intelligence to understand abandonment. The bullet I fired hadn't just torn through flesh, it had torn through a family unit. I looked at my hands, shaking in my gloves, and saw them not as the hands of a healer, but as the hands of a destroyer who had come within inches of ending a lineage. The guilt I had felt before was a dull ache. This was a sharp, agonizing blade twisting in my stomach. The male stood up, keeping a protective hand on the juvenile's shoulder, and turned to look at me. He didn't bring the young one closer. He kept a distinct distance, a boundary I was not allowed to cross. He pointed to the child, then pointed to the scar on his own chest, and finally pointed at me. The gesture was simple, brutal, and devastatingly clear. This is what you almost broke. This is the cost of your pride. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed, teaching me the final lesson of consequences. He wanted me to see the face of the victim I never considered. I sank to my knees in the snow, unable to stand under the weight of his judgment. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words feeling pitiful and small. I didn't know. But ignorance is no excuse in the wild. He stared at me for a long moment, letting the image burn into my retinas, the giant and the child, standing alone against a world that wanted them dead. He was showing me that my actions rippled out far beyond the moment of the trigger pull. Every life I took had a connection, a history, a dependent. He turned back to the juvenile, murmuring soft reassurances, and led it back into the safety of the hemlocks. He didn't invite me into the sanctuary. That door remained closed. We had reached the limit of his forgiveness. He returned to me a few minutes later alone, his face set in a grim, stoic mask. He gestured for us to leave to head back down the mountain toward my camp. The walk back was silent, the air heavy with the unspoken truth that our time was done. He had shown me the stakes, and now that I understood the value of what I had almost destroyed, he was preparing to sever the tie. By early December, the winter had fully tightened its grip on the Cascades, turning the world into a monochromatic landscape of white snow and black timber. The creature's recovery was absolute. The limp that had defined his movement for weeks was gone, replaced by the terrifying fluid power of his natural gait. I watched him move boulders to get to grubs, testing his torque, flexing the muscles around the scar tissue on his chest. He was no longer the invalid in the lean-to. He was the king of the canyon again, and the shelter I had built was becoming too small to hold him. The balance had shifted back, and I knew my time as his guardian was over. He began to distance himself from me incrementally, a weaning process that was as painful as it was necessary. He stopped accepting the fish I caught, catching his own with a speed and dexterity that made my traps look pathetic. He slept further away from the fire, reacclimating his body to the bitter cold, hardening himself against the comfort I had provided. It wasn't a rejection, it was a preparation. He was getting ready to return to a world where there were no blankets, no cooked food, and no humans to watch over him. He was sharpening the edges that domesticity had dulled. The final morning broke with a sky the color of bruised slate, the air heavy with the promise of a massive storm. He didn't go off to forage. He waited for me by the dying embers of the fire, his posture rigid and expectant. He gestured toward the creek, to a flat granite shelf where we had spent hours sitting in silence. We walked there together, leaving 2 sets of tracks in the fresh powder, boot prints and bare feet side by side for the last time. We sat on the cold stone, watching the water rush over the ice, the silence between us heavy with things that couldn't be said. He turned to me and did something he hadn't done since the day I shot him. He touched the wound. He ran his massive fingers over the raised, hairless keloid scar on his chest, tracing the jagged line of the trauma. Then he pointed to me, and then back to the scar. He wasn't accusing me. He was acknowledging the history. "This is what happened," he seemed to say. "This is part of me now, and you are the one who put it there, and the one who healed it." It was a final accounting of the ledger, a recognition that we were permanently linked by that mark. I looked at him, memorizing the gray in his beard, the depth of his eyes, the smell of him. I wanted to tell him to be careful, to watch out for other hunters, to never trust a human again. But I knew he already understood that. I was the anomaly, the exception that proved the rule. He looked at me with a gaze that felt ancient and weary, devoid of the curiosity that had marked our early days. He had learned everything he needed to know about me. I was capable of great violence and great mercy, a confusing, dangerous creature that he had survived. He stood up, his knees cracking in the cold, and looked up at the ridgeline where the storm clouds were gathering. He let out a low, deep breath that misted in the air, a sigh of finality. He didn't offer a handshake or a hug. Those are human gestures, and he was reclaiming his wildness. He simply looked down at me one last time, holding my gaze until I was forced to look away from the intensity of it. It was a dismissal. "Go back to your world," his eyes said. "This one is mine again." He turned his back to me, exposing the massive width of his shoulders, and began to walk upstream. He didn't look back. He didn't pause at the tree line. He moved with a steady, rhythmic stride that ate up the ground, moving away from the fire and the man and the memory of pain. I watched him until he was just a dark speck against the snow, and then until he was nothing but a shadow, and finally, until the forest swallowed him whole. He was gone, returned to the myth from which he came, taking the magic of the valley with him. I sat on the rock for an hour after he vanished, feeling a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight in my chest. The woods felt empty, stripped of their soul. I realized that for the last 2 months, I hadn't been living in the wilderness. I had been living in a society of two. Now I was just a man alone in the woods, surrounded by cold rocks and trees that didn't care if I lived or died. The protection was gone. The companionship was gone. All that remained was the long hike out and the heavy burden of the truth. I went back to the camp and dismantled it with a frantic energy, needing to erase the evidence of our time together. I kicked apart the fire ring, scattered the shelter logs, and buried the fish trap. I wanted to leave no trace that a human and a giant had coexisted here, protecting his sanctuary from the prying eyes of future hunters. I packed my gear, the rifle feeling heavy and hateful on my shoulder, a tool I vowed never to use again. I hiked out as the snow began to fall in earnest, covering our tracks, wiping the slate clean. By the time I reached my truck at the trailhead, the valley was just a white blur in the rearview mirror. I drove back toward the lights of the town, toward the noise and the people. But part of me never left that canyon. I had left the hunter back there, buried in the snow, and the man who drove home was someone else entirely, a man who had looked into the eyes of the impossible and been forgiven. I returned to civilization in January 1975, but the man who drove the truck back into town wasn't the same one who had left it. The lights of the street lamps looked harsh and artificial. The noise of the traffic sounded like chaotic screaming compared to the silence of the canyon. I walked into my house, a place filled with taxidermy mounts, deer heads, elk antlers, a bear rug, and I felt a wave of nausea so violent I had to lean against the wall. Those weren't trophies anymore. They were corpses. They were the silent witnesses to a lifetime of murder that I had mistaken for sport. I covered them with sheets that first night, unable to sleep under the glass gazes of the things I had killed. The next morning, I went out to the workshop with a grim determination, carrying the tools of my trade in a heavy bundle. I laid out my rifles, the .30-06, the lever action, the shotgun, on the workbench where I used to clean them with loving care. I didn't sell them. I couldn't put them in another man's hands to do the same work. I took an acetylene torch and cut the barrels in half, melting the actions into useless slag. The smell of burning steel and gun oil filled the air, a funeral pyre for the hunter I used to be. It wasn't a sacrifice. It was a sanitation, a cleansing of the instruments that had almost cost me my soul. The social fallout was immediate and confusing to my friends, men who defined themselves by the autumn harvest. They came around for the next season, expecting me to lead the camp, and I turned them away at the door. I told them I was done, that I had lost the taste for it, but I couldn't tell them why. How do you explain that a monster taught you mercy? They laughed at first, then they got angry, calling me soft and old, whispering that I had lost my nerve. In a way, they were right. I had lost the nerve to take a life without feeling the crushing weight of the universe bearing down on me. I became a ghost in my own community, an eccentric who walked the woods with a camera instead of a weapon. I spent the next decades trying to atone, engaging in a quiet form of conservation that confused everyone who knew my past. I spoke out at town halls against overhunting, against clear-cutting, advocating for the preservation of the deep wild places. I was dismissed as a hypocrite, a reformed butcher preaching to the choir, but I didn't care. I wasn't speaking for the deer or the elk. I was speaking for the king of the canyon, protecting the sanctuary he had shown me. The secret of 1974 became a heavy, solitary stone that I carried in my pocket every day. There were times I wanted to scream the truth, to tell the biologists and the skeptics that we are not alone, that we are sharing this planet with a superior moral intellect. But I knew what would happen if I did. The helicopters would come, the men with tranquilizer darts and cages would swarm the valley, and the peace I had bought with my silence would be shattered. I protected him by letting the world believe I was just a crazy old man who had lost his edge. My perspective on humanity shifted darker, cynical and sad, as I watched how we treat the world. I realized that the creature was right to hide from us, right to fear the hairless apes who consume everything they touch. We call them beasts. Yet we are the ones who kill for sport, for fun, for trophies. He killed only to survive, and even then, he did it with a reverence we can't comprehend. I looked at the people in the grocery store, in the church, and wondered if any of them had the capacity for forgiveness that the giant had shown me in the mud. As I aged, the physical reminder of that winter stayed with me, the ache in my knees from the cold, the stiffness in my hands. But the mental image was sharper, untouched by time. I could still see his face, the steam rising from his shoulders, the scar on his chest that mirrored the scar on my conscience. I wondered if he was still out there, if he was teaching his own young to avoid the man with the gun. I hoped he was. I hoped he remembered me not as the enemy, but as the student who finally learned the lesson. Now, at the end of my life, the need to confess is stronger than the need to protect, simply because I am the last witness. I am telling this story not to lead you to him. I will never give the coordinates of that canyon, but to lead you to yourself. I want you to know that the woods are watching you. When you step into the timber, you are being weighed and measured by eyes you cannot see. There is a law in the wild that is older than our Constitution, a law of respect and consequence, and we violate it at our peril. I never went back to that specific ridge, terrified that my presence would draw others, or worse, that I would find him gone. I preferred to live with the memory of him walking away, strong and alive, reclaiming his kingdom. I realized that some things are too beautiful to be owned, too wild to be studied. He was a mystery that deserved to remain unsolved, a question mark in the shape of a man that challenged everything we think we know. So, bury my rifles with my past. I am not a hunter anymore. I am a witness. I am the man who pulled the trigger and wished he hadn't, the man who held the hand of a monster and found a brother. If you go into the woods, go quietly. Go with respect. And if you see a shadow that moves too smooth for a bear and too heavy for a man, lower your eyes, step back, and be grateful that he chose to let you leave.